All right, so here it is in all its glory. I think at one point I put together a video working on this thing, but it ended up not going anywhere. So I never posted it, and I guess I'll talk about that whenever this thing actually starts moving somewhere. But some work has been done to it over the holiday break, and pretty much rust repair has been all I've done to it. So the motor is stripped out of it. No motor, no transmission. Sold the transmission. Still have the motor for sale. Decided to completely and totally ditch the original drivetrain. And then, so part of the reason that I want to do this is just kind of show, at least from what I can gather, why these cars rust so bad. But first we'll look at how much rust repair had to be done. So, had to do that corner there. There was a little rust hole there. Both sides rotted out right there in the floor. But it was kind of weird that they did that because that is not exposed to the road underneath there because has the subframe encased around it. And then pretty much the entire section of front floorboard and some going up into the trans tunnel had to be cut out and replaced. And I forget what size metal I used for this. I think it was 16 gauge. Might have been 18. It was noticeably thicker than the material the car is made out of. I don't know what gauge these cars are made out of, but it was not enough. Because especially, well, for the floorboards it was fine, but where the real problem is the jacking points for the subframe, because the metal wasn't thick enough and they bent up and collapsed, and then rust got in there and it pretty much just rotted out the subframe all the way through on both sides of the car, which was awesome. So that's the extent of the floorboard repair there that I did. Just cut the piece out and then just sat it in here and hammered a whole bunch in that area to get that contour right. Did a lot of welding. I think I have 4.5 of the small spools of welding wire in this thing. And yes, the welds are not that stellar, but given this is the first time, the whole deal was the first time I'd ever had to weld sheet metal, I feel like I did fairly decent, given that welding sheet metal was incredibly difficult with a flux core welder, because that's all I have. Yeah, so there is the new floor pan, and here is the new jacking point made out of the thicker metal, and I staggered how I cut it. So I cut it, it comes down, and instead of just making it go straight across, I drug it out into the good metal to give me more, pretty much more length of weld to hold it all together, so that way it can't just fracture all the way through one spot. It has, it would have to work up and down the subframe. And then, yeah, same deal back there, although not as extreme. It comes down, and then I staggered it, made it zigzag around a little bit. And inside this piece of metal, I put some ribs and some bracing in there, and then a strap across the top of it just to give it some more strength to help keep it from bending. And of course, that's all welded to the floor, welded to pretty much anywhere it's touching. It's welded all the way around. So that was all rotted out. The driver's side was the considerably better side. Oh, the other thing I did is there was a section that came out of the triangular, whatever part of the subframe that welds up to the firewall. and it had a little piece coming out of it, and I don't know if it was welded to the floor or not originally, but I made a little tab, and that's what that kind of that little U-shaped deal is. And that's where I welded that to a little tab to the floor, and then to that piece that was coming out of the subframe. And I fogged a whole bunch of black spray paint up in there, just whatever 2-in-1 primer stuff, just to try and protect all that, because all of the metal inside the subframe is just all bare metal, which is probably part of the reason it rusts so bad once water gets in there. And I went ahead and painted some of that in there. Because of those braces I put in there, I'm not going to be able to spray anything up in there. But later I do plan to spray some kind of metal treatment and some kind of paint sealer in the whole subframe, just to try and protect it a little bit. Passenger side was considerably worse. So we had the usual rust here in the corner, except it went further up by the seat bracket, and I got that all welded to the rocker good. Because right there where those two deals coming out is, that's where the whatever the rear subframe, whatever suspension deal, K-member, whatever the heck it's called, bolts up to the car. So I wanted to make sure that that was all, you know, structurally sound as best as I could make it, at least. And just had a whole bunch of rust, especially there around that seat bolt. And this side is pretty much destroyed, but got a piece made in there and got it all put back together. So it's a lot better than it was, but it's a whole lot of rust repair. That was the little welder I used. I went and got that just to do this. It was just the cheapest one at Lowe's. It's just a little Century welder, which worked really good. I like that it actually has knobs on it that you can just kind of fine tune it to whatever you want instead of just two switches that you flip around. So I like that. And so here's the jacking point on this side. Still staggered it so it's not just one, you know, straight joint. And then this one I did differently, and I kind of wish I'd done the other side like this, but it's probably, the other side's probably plenty strong as it is. And I took the tab, and instead of cutting that tab off that I bent it up against the subframe and welded it in too. But this side, by the, you know, sheer difference in the part I had to replace, you could tell just how much more rotted this side was. This side was absolutely terrible as far as the subframe goes. And there was even a hole back in here on the inside of the subframe that I had to cut out and patch. So it was just an absolute mess. But the car has hope now. So instead of just being a complete and total piece of junk, it actually has, you know, some kind of hope now, because that was the bulk of the rust repair. Really the only, the rest of the rust repair is, I can't really see it, but it's in the spare tire area. And down in this area, which my dad already cut it out because he wanted to play around with it too, This area here was really where the major body rust was. But as a whole, it really didn't have a whole lot of rust in the body. It was all just in the cabin here. And looking at some other ones online, it seems like I got off pretty lucky on rust, given that some other people's cars were, rotted all the way back to that brace and all up the firewall, and yeah, more than I would ever want to deal with. That if this car had been like that, that would have been the end of it. But, so why do these cars rust so bad? Well, based on, my guesswork here and what I can reason is, if you'll notice, pretty much just looking around online, all these cars rot out in the same places, right there at the front of the floorboard, both sides, and the subframe, and then they rot out here behind the seats. So it has to be a design fault for all these cars to be rotting out in the same place. And it's also worth noting, they rot out straight across the car. You look at that patch over there, I mean, they're in the exact same plane. Same deal over here. We got all these patches in the same line. And so what I figured out is here in the floorboard, right in the middle of those two big patches that I had to do, there used to be a seam there that ran all the way across. And here, through these patches, right there you can see it, there's also a seam that runs all the way across the car. And that seam isn't inherently the problem, but it's kind of the Achilles heel of it. And then the seam sealer they used is really the arrow that did it in. So, had a lot of metal I had to cut out of the car, and these are some of the more noticeable pieces. This was on the passenger side, where somebody had also jumped this car at some point, or they hit one hell of a bump, because this isn't damage from jacking it up. This is damage from this piece of the subframe hitting the asphalt and bending it. And you can tell that the car hit something because you can see how that fender is kinked right there. That fender hit the ground and bent up, and the driver's side is the exact same way. So somebody did something rowdy in this car. But I saved these pieces to show how this seam was the issue. So you can look at this piece that rusted, and this is the seam. No seam sealer. No seam sealer whatsoever. And you can see peeling back this seam sealer, it's all just rusted under that, or undercoat, it's all rusted under the undercoat. And this was something I cut with the grinder, and you can look in there and it's all just rust. And here's another example. This is what this looked like from inside the car before I cut it out. There was a tiny little pinhole, and I just decided to cut it out and just see what was what with it. That was what was inside of it. So this was all bent down closed, couldn't tell what was going on, but inside this seam, it was just completely and totally rotted out. Here's another piece from the driver's side. You can see this one still has some seam sealer on it, but not up there anymore. And this was the side that was facing the road, and you can see absolutely no seam sealer, and the undercoat is all just coming off of it, and it's all rusting under the undercoat. I forget which side this came off of. Oh, this was the driver's side, because the passenger side had nothing left. And you can see this is the remnants of the seam where it overlapped, and most of it's just rotted away. But what happened was, in all these instances where this rust is coming through, is they didn't apply the seam sealer good on these cars, or the seam sealer itself wasn't good enough. because I've just looking under the car, working on it, I found several instances just around the trans tunnel where the seam sealer, the person applying the seam sealer didn't do the whole seam. You know, they either got off track or just skipped it altogether. And if you do that on a section, you know, one of these seams that's exposed to moisture, well, water's going to get into that seam where there's no protected, you know, where the metal is unprotected because it obviously can't get painted because it's welded to, you know, it's overlapped and welded, and it's just going to start rotting, and you're not going to know it until it's catastrophic. So that's what it did with all the subframe stuff, is it got in that seam, and then just as soon as it got into the subframe, it just started rotting it all out because all of it was unprotected metal inside the subframe as well. So that is my reasoning for why these cars rust so bad, is that they just were not prepped correctly. I mean, maybe if they had done the seam sealer correctly, and if the seam sealer had held up better, it'd probably been fine. But best I can tell, that is the reason that these things rust as bad as they do. Because expect all the rust in the cabin was, excluding a few areas, you know, like that one in the middle of the floor there. Excluding a few areas, they pretty much, all the patches touched a seam somewhere where the rust kind of originated from. So that's I guess a big point on these cars. And what I'm going to do is, at least on the underside of the cars, I'm going to completely strip all the undercoat and everything off of the where the seams are at, and I'm going to reseal that and put some PR15 and then maybe some undercoat on top of that, just to try and keep this from happening again. But anyways, this is probably getting pretty lengthy, but so there is some progress on this thing. Not going to be any progress on it probably till late summer, just because I won't have time to mess with it. But there is this turd as of now. Got a whole bunch of rust repair done. Took forever to do. Oh, the amount of metal to do it. I bought two 2x4 inch sheets, or 2x4 4-foot sheets. And this is all I have left after doing all the work I've done. And this piece here would probably be enough to do the spare tire area. So a single 2x4 foot sheet would have been plenty to do everything that I needed to do. So I guess there's that for future reference for anybody who needs to figure out how much metal they need. And it's just a ton of welding wire. Like I mean, it'll probably be 5 or 6 spools of welding wire before this is all said and done. But anyways, there's that. Some progress made. Oh, she's going good now. Yeah, the undercoat they put on these things burns pretty good. It'll go for about 10 or 15 seconds and then peter out. So that's fun.